Hi, I'm Bill Fletcher. Welcome to The Global African. Every week, we'll discuss the issues that impact not only the people living on the continent of Africa, north, south, east, and west, but those who, thanks to the colonialism, have created what we call the African diasporas, from blacks in the Americas to the culturally diverse peoples of Afro-Caribbean and Afro-European descent. We'll together do a deep dive into what it means to be a global African in the 21st century. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for joining us in this journey as we together explore the African world. According to former UNESCO scholar Ivan van Sertima, indigenous people of the African continent came to the shores of the Americas for thousands of years prior to the arrival of the European colonization. Even the early Spanish explorers of the Western Hemisphere came by way of the guidance and assistance of Africans, such as a man known as Estevanico, an African Moor who was the first non-Native American to discover what is now called Arizona and New Mexico. However, the largest arrival of African people to the Americas came between the 16th century and the 19th century, during the Mafa, also known as the Triangular Trade. According to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, over 12.5 million African people were kidnapped and brought to the Western Hemisphere. During this period, which many scholars have called the Black Holocaust, African people were forced into chattel slavery, which denied the fundamental rights to humanity. After 200 years of enslavement, the descendants of African peoples overcame chattel slavery and antebellum society, only to face new forms of oppression called Jim Crow after the end of the period known as Reconstruction and the beginning of the Great Compromise of 1877. 100 years after the end of chattel slavery, during the 1960s, indigenous Black Americans were still fighting for equal citizenship in every stratum of society. But after World War II, during the late 1940s and early 50s, 80 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, a new wave of African people began to voluntarily migrate to the United States seeking opportunity. By the 1970s, the U.S. had passed new civil rights legislation, and most of the African continent had been decolonized. With the decolonization of Africa came an even greater African migration to the United States. This created two historically distinct and unique communities. On the one hand, the descendants of the involuntarily enslaved Africans. On the other, the voluntary African immigrants. In the 21st century, the relationship between these two groups becomes more tantamount. African immigration to the United States has grown exponentially. According to the report by the Immigration Policy Center from June 2012, in the first decade of the new millennium, the African-born population nearly doubled in size from 880,000 people in 2000 to approximately 1.6 million in 2010, with the largest population being immigrants from Western and Eastern Africa, with the majority being from Nigeria, while the group with the largest increase being from Ethiopia. More than 37% of African immigrants work in management, business, science, and the arts. Today on The Global African, we will examine the experience of African immigrants and their complicated relationships with indigenous Black Americans. Today, The Global African welcomes as our guest Mr. Nii Acuta. Nii is the former executive director of the advocacy group Africa Action and the former editor of the Journal of the Trans-Africa Forum. Nii is originally from Ghana in West Africa and is here to speak with us today about the issue of African immigration. Thank you very much for coming.
Such a pleasure to be here, Bill. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. Nii, I'm going to ask you a question that I think is on the minds of many African Americans, but we're too polite to ask it. In light of the history of white supremacy in the United States, chattel slavery, Jim Crow, everything else, why would an African voluntarily migrate to the United States?
I think it's a great question. There are several pieces of the answer, and I think your preference actually is wonderful, goes to the core of the issue, given the history of racism and white supremacy in this country. Unfortunately, we Africans don't know that as much. It's kept from us. We know a little bit of it depending on your country, and being from Ghana and Nkrumah having studied here and his connection with African Americans, we got to know a bit of it. In fact, the U.S. Embassy used to be upset that it will talk about Jim Crow and lynchings. Okay. So Ghanaians knew a little bit about it. So number one, we Africans come because we don't know that much of the history. But even if we did know, people will still come. I will still have come, because I think there are two other aspects of it. It's just the normal human beings thing of go see the world, explore the world. But the other thing, in fact, last year, I had a privilege of talking about Africa in the next 50 years, and I say, in fact, people of African descent need to be experts of what is going on in the world, because our history, both here in the United States and in Africa, is that when we ignore what is going on in the world descends on us and we lose. So I actually think it is good to go out in the world, find out what is going on, see face to face, and of course we get to make good alliances if we play our cards well. So frankly, I think Africans coming to the United States is a good opportunity. Even those who go through hard times, it is very educational.
But given what you just said,
yes,
and the lack of background in many cases,
right,
when Africans arrive here,
yes,
African immigrants,
yes,
must be a shock to the system.
It is a shock to the system. It's very much a shock to the system. And, also the other part of it is one of the motivations, of course, there is Hollywood. And Hollywood's representation of African Americans is nowhere near what it should be. It's terrible. Mm-hmm. But a lot of Africans, especially my generation growing up, African American artists and musicians and athletes were our heroes. So, people name themselves after them and all that. So there was also the other pull factor. But yes, it is very much a shock when you get here, and some of us never get over the shock.
Mm. So let's talk about who actually comes here.
Right.
The information that I've seen indicates a very high proportion of professionals.
Yes.
So there's two questions that arise out of that. One is, what happens when African professionals get here? Are they able to transfer their skills? And the second is, isn't this something of a brain drain on the continent itself?
It is, if I might take it backwards,
Sure.
it is a brain drain, no question about it. But in fact, people have been trying to turn it around, because no matter how well educated you are when you get here, people actually come here for a lot more education, like me. So you get further education, then you get professional experience, and you network with people. So your professional skills expand. And what people are now trying to do is to find a way to have people go back and share what they have learned. So it is a brain drain, but that is not the end of the story. It can be turned around. Now, what happens when African professionals get here? I think they get traumatized. I hear a lot of African professionals in our community moaning and groaning, and I get tired of it. And what I tell them is, listen, you are more privileged than any other African. Okay, you got the best education, and most of us were educated with the money of the state, the poor people in Africa. Then we didn't stay to contribute. We come here, and yes, things are hard here, but we have to compare it to people we left back home. So my attitude is, think more about what you can do rather than talk about the difficulties you are going through here. But people do go through difficulties. The reason that there is a high proportion of Africans with higher education, Bill, is pretty simple. Once slavery was ended here, this country did not want Africans anymore. So it was very difficult to come here. The only way you could come here is if you were going to graduate school or undergraduate. So this is how it is that the brain drain started. The U.S. embassies will only give you a visa. Even before Africa became independent, as British subjects, they will let you come here if you'd be admitted, or if you can make a good case that you are going to get higher education.
And this is consistent with the other kind of racial standards of immigration that existed until about 1965.
Absolutely. And even for Africans, that changed. It was made a little bit better a bit back, because they had what they call the visa lottery. where countries that are underrepresented in terms of immigration to the U.S., and which is mostly African countries, people there can apply to join the lottery and win visas to come here. So more Africans have been coming here who didn't have to prove that they were coming to graduate school. But even that has been sacrificed in the new immigration bill that is being talked about. If it passes, that is over. So we'll revert back to, if you're going to come here and you are from Africa, you better be a professional or a millionaire who says you are coming to invest.
So in what ways is the experience of African immigrants with race here in the United States similar and distinct from the traditional African American population?
It is hard to say, and also here I have to tell you, given the work we did at Trans-Africa and apartheid, I noticed, I'm from Ghana, West Africa. Southern Africans and even African Americans used to tease us that you guys, Southern Africans, understand better, you know, the whole issue of race, because they had settlers there, they had white settlers there, and there was apartheid there. In West Africa, the environment, the climate was so terrible that you got only a few European colonialist bureaucrats staying. So most of West Africa did not have experience with white people and racism. So to a certain extent, many West Africans or from outside of Southern Africa, sometimes we miss the racism. It has to slap us in the face before we recognize it. But on the other hand, I mean, things like police brutality. You know, the police don't take care to distinguish between whether a black person is from the Caribbean, was born here, or was born in Africa. Amadou Diallo in New York was a perfect case. Right. So in some respects, it is the same thing. It is a black person with racism being committed and violence being committed. In other ways, also, you know, African society and African peoples, especially, you are trained that you have to be a good guest. So sometimes we are more docile. We are less prone to speak up and say, look, we will not take this. This is wrong. It's like, well, I'm a stranger. I better be quiet, and they let me stay. So I think sometimes we turn a blind eye to the racism, but the longer we stay here, the better we learn. One quick example, one group of people who are now complaining about racism, although I'm not sure if you can charge it to the US or just the entire Western world, is professionals in the World Bank. Africans in the World Bank are highly educated. Now, I have criticism of the World Bank, and therefore I have criticisms of Africans who work there and make the system work. But now they have started finding out that the system doesn't treat them well. In fact, I just saw an essay by Reverend Jackson where he talked about how badly the World Bank treats African Americans and Africans.
One of the experiences that I've encountered is that it relates to what we were talking about before. Not a full appreciation of the way race plays itself out here, and a sort of ambivalent attitude towards African Americans.
Yeah.
And I didn't know whether that was just like a personal perception or whether it's something that you've encountered.
I have encountered it. I mean, a way to cut to it is that when I look at Africans here and the African Americans, I think the relationship between the two groups is not what I would like it to be. But I'm an activist, and I'm a perfectionist. I want things solved immediately. So I would like the relationship to be much better between African Americans and African immigrants. And of course, I think it won't get better by itself until some leaders and activists take it on and make it better. But there's no question that there are frictions at all levels, especially at lower levels when people have to scrounge around for the same jobs. You know, you can understand, I mean, even though Africans come in with a lot of education, many of us are forced to do jobs below our level. And therefore, there is some resentment of that. You have to drive trucks, you have to deliver newspapers, you have to drive taxis. And I have seen, therefore, you know, you are elbowing those who are also competing for those same jobs. And frequently, they happen to be other African Americans. And I also don't think the two groups understand each other as much as they should. Like I said, Africans, and I blame us for not understanding the history of the United States, because again, we have a lot of education and we come here and reading books is what we are proud of. So it seems to me it's our job to understand the history of this country. And many African immigrants don't. And even I'm not done understanding the country well. And I think if you study the country well, you ought to have a lot of sympathy for African Americans and the role they have played in building this country that is so wonderful that you want to come to it. And so I think there are things to be done, but I hold African immigrants, I put a lot of responsibility on their part to help make the relationship better. Of course, they are tiny compared to African Americans, so it has to be a two-way street.
Right. Well, you know, one of the things that makes me think about it is also the communities remain fairly distinct, ironically, even when people seem to be living in the same neighborhoods.
Yes.
That it doesn't necessarily feel that there's this interaction, at least at the generational level of the people that are first migrating here. And what I've wondered about, but I have seen no documentation, is whether the future of the African immigrant is going to be actually much like the future, the way that things transpired with Caribbean migrants. That is, they came here, they often had distinct communities, and then usually within 1 or 2 generations, there was this intermixing between the Caribbean migrant community and the African American, so that it's very hard to disentangle that. I mean, Malcolm X, for example, whose mother was Grenadian heritage, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, there's countless examples. I mean, in my own family, and there's all these ironies connected with that. I wonder whether you expect that that's the trajectory.
I think the great word you use is expect. Yes, I expect that to happen. I tell my African immigrant friends all the time, because sometimes, I mean, I'll talk with people and say, no, I'm Tanzanian. And I say, okay, that's what you say. Your child who was born here, how does he see himself?
Right.
Okay, our children here. My son tells me, my daughter told me, listen, Dad, you are the African, I'm African American. Okay, so I think, yes, that merging will happen. A lot of African immigrants like me, those born in Africa who have children here, we see our identities very tied to a particular country and also tied to Africa. And we think it's going to remain that way, and we see that, okay, here is the African born and here is the African Americans, but we are finding out to our shock that our children are defining themselves very differently, and they are African Americans. So precisely my expectation is that merging will happen, even though the second, third generation immigrants from Africa, many African immigrants, what they do is they send their kids back home for a while. So they as kids, and even when they are having discipline issues in school. I mean, I have seen friends do that, and I'm astounded by it, and it seems to work. Sometimes they send the kids to Africa where the environment is very different for 2-3 years of school, and they come back. My point, therefore, is that merging will happen, but you will have kids who have had some experience going back home. But unquestionably, I expect that merging to happen. And I tell the African immigrants that, listen, the African American community, they have done so much in building the country. They have done a lot. And even today, if you don't want to know the history, look at today. In America, you want government to do something that is politics. Politics is numbers, okay? And therefore, it is better if we merge with African Americans who will have bigger numbers to throw around. African immigrants by themselves, nobody is really going to take us seriously because our numbers are so tiny.
Well, that actually is an interesting segue into something that I know that's been important to you. For many years, you've been talking about the need to develop the African immigrant community's voice,
yes,
particularly on both U.S. policy towards Africa, but also on the developments in Africa. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Oh, absolutely, because I think, Bill, you know, if I dare say that African Americans who look at U.S. policy in Africa, especially independent Africa, two things will strike them, two crises, the Congo crisis and apartheid. Both of those, the U.S. was heavily involved, okay, and not in a good way. So the question always is, and to me, I like to stress, as the U.S., democracy in the U.S. is far from perfect, but it has political space so that people can push things in the right direction. So my point is, if we want the U.S. to behave better, to have better policies in Africa, a number of Americans, a movement in America has to get strong. And who better to get that going than African immigrants? I mean, it is our countries. We have relatives there. I mean, most of my family is back there. Somebody, a friend was just teasing me about doing something on policy. Why do you do all this? Why sometimes I'm defending government policy. I say, why are you doing it for them? I said, no, I'm not doing it for them. I'm doing it for my sister who raised me back in Ghana. It's because of her that I'm pushing for policies that I think will be better for her. So for that reason, I really think African immigrants, I thought that it's been too late in coming. But I think that actually there's a bit of good news, because last year, a group of African immigrants in the Washington, Virginia, Maryland area came together as African immigrants, not as Nigerians, not as South Africans, not as Ghanaians. And I'm very excited about it. We call it the African Immigrant Caucus. So I have joined it. We are trying to create this umbrella and speak with one voice, both on African immigrant experiences on the ground here, but also my passion, getting involved and making sure that U.S. policy in Africa, we shine a light on it. And there is a lot of things that need to be corrected. From my point of view, number one being U.S. supporting terrible dictators in Africa, and then they cause a lot of damage, and everybody says, oh, these guys can't run Africa.
Right. Nee, it's been a pleasure having you on the program. Thank you very much for joining us and spending the time with us.
The pleasure is mine. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I want to thank you for joining us for this episode of The Global African. I'm your host, Bill Fletcher, and look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks a lot.
For more information on today's topic, we suggest the following books: The African Presence in Ancient America, They Came Before Columbus, by Ivan van Sertima. Estevanico the Black, by John Upton Terrell. Next week on The Global African, we will discuss the Western Sahara, the last African colony. Our guest will feature Dr. Jacob Mundy of Colgate University, an expert on North African conflict.
Is that Morocco's settlers in the territory, who outnumber the indigenous population by at least 2 to 1, are there illegally, and Morocco has violated international humanitarian law by bringing so many of its citizens into the territory. Other applications of the Geneva Conventions in terms of maltreatment of the population, daily abuses, torture.
Ambassador Mohammed Baysat of the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic and representative of Polisario.
This Moroccan lack of political will to cooperate with the United Nations to resolve the problem is the main issue. Nevertheless, and as accessory to that, the position of some Western powers who tend to support Morocco, right or wrong.
Tune in next time on The Global African.